Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And today, I'd like to talk about villains. Now we currently live in a golden age of villains. Between Thanos, Eric Killmonger, the Joker, and Walter White, there has been a veritable surge of compelling villains in all sorts of media. I honestly can't remember a time when the villains had this much going for them. Yes, there's still a place for the kind of pure evil Disney villains, but the current trend has brought us a more refined brand of villainy, and honestly, it feels both refreshing and overdue. As a lifelong fan of superhero comics and movies, I've scrutinized the hero-villain dynamic more than most. In doing so, I've noticed plenty of trends. Like most aspects of popular culture, it's always evolving. Very few themes remain constant, especially when it comes to antagonists. But there's still one theme that has remained somewhat constant over the course of my lifetime. It's also a trend that seems to be intensifying, albeit in subtle ways. Some of it coincides with the growing complexity of villains, but most of the trend precedes the current era of superhero-dominated media. If anything, superhero media helped accelerate it. You see, most villains or heroes rarely identify with certain political affiliations, but it's usually not hard to discern how most of them would vote in a contemporary election. I would argue that it's easier to surmise a villain's political leanings compared to those of the heroes. Take any villain from the last 10 years of movies, comics, and TV shows. Chances are, most would identify as conservative. Now, I understand that conservatism is a very broad term. Yes, it has a dictionary definition, but as a political philosophy, there are so many subsets, divisions, and variations. There are fiscal conservatives, social conservatives, neoconservatives. There are many wildly different ideologies that still identify as conservative, and a few even clash with one another. Personally, I know many people who identify as conservative, and every one of them has their own unique idea of what it means to be a conservative. Those complexities aside, there are still some core tenets associated with it. Chief among conservative values is the idea that traditional norms, institutions, and values should be maintained. Change isn't actively dissuaded, but it is viewed with caution and suspicion. To be conservative is to affirm the status quo, at least to some extent. Now that's all well and good if the status quo is beneficial to everyone. It's not quite as preferable for those who either fail to benefit or are actively screwed over by that system. Since no society in history has ever achieved perfect prosperity for everyone, there's bound to be a few people who get left behind. In our own real-world history, we've seen people from those disaffected groups fight the status quo to make their lives better. That struggle has played out in the civil rights movement of the 60s, the movement for women's rights in the 70s, and the LGBT rights movement that's still going on today. Those who oppose these movements tend to have, broadly speaking, conservative leanings. They still might not identify as conservative, but their values are consistent with the basic principles. Just look at the groups who opposed the civil rights movement. Just look at those who actively opposed LGBT rights, women's rights, and immigrants. They all espouse rhetoric that would put them at odds with the likes of Superman, Captain America, and most other superheroes who valued truth, justice, and peace. For some villains, their talking points sound like ideas that only villains in the mold of Lex Luthor would agree with. Again, not all of them identify as conservative, but the standard principles are there. It usually goes like this. Anything too different from the status quo must be wrong or evil. Anybody too different from everyone else in a society must be bad, evil, or devious. Any deviant idea, trend, or movement is something to be opposed or feared. And it doesn't just manifest in superhero movies or underdog stories either. Just look at a movie like Footloose. In that story, the people who ban dancing are these uptight, dogmatic religious zealots who likely voted for Ronald Reagan in 1984, which is when this movie came out. They were clearly the antagonists of that story, and the kids, while they never say outright that they're liberal, still dare to defy them. It can even manifest subtly in other media. In kids' shows like Recess, Hey Arnold, or Rocko's Modern Life, the most common antagonists are these uptight authority figures. They have no tolerance for new ideas, big changes, or anything remotely fun. It's hard to imagine any of these characters voting for someone who builds their slogan around change, reform, or reinvention. For the most part, they like things the way they are. Most of them benefit from the current system and will seek to preserve it in any way they can. While they won't always see themselves as villains, it's difficult for them to come off as heroes. You can only be so heroic when your political affiliation is closely aligned with predatory business practices, fun-hating religious zealots, and unabashed warmongers. Again, I understand this does not encapsulate all conservatives, but the pattern is there. Now that's not to say it's impossible for liberals to be villains. It does happen, and it can be quite effective. In fact, I would argue that Eric Killmonger in Black Panther was more in line with an extreme liberal revolutionary, so was Ra's al Ghul in Batman Begins. Their motivations are clear. They don't just want to pursue change. They seek to violently destroy the entire system and build a new one, coincidentally one that's dominated by them. And if innocent people suffer and die because of it, well, then that's a price worth paying. Like Thanos, they're willing to pay that price. It's liberal in the sense that it seeks to progress society from its current trends. It's just willing to do it by force. That kind of revolutionary liberalism exists in the real world too, and it can make for compelling villains. However, the number of villains who align themselves with Killmonger are far fewer than those who would align themselves with Lex Luthor. In general, it's easier to resist change rather than pursue it. It's also necessary for those resisting change to be these uptight authority figures who want to preserve order rather than expand freedom. They have to be okay with coercing others to maintain traditions, with violence if necessary. Logistically, the villains in any conflict who seek systemic progress must be conservative. That's not to say that villains will always lean conservative in popular media. What it means to be conservative changes over time. In fact, if you listen to conservative rhetoric 50 years ago, it sounds very different. It might even sound liberal by today's standards. The same goes for liberalism in previous eras. It hasn't always been closely aligned with the politics of minority rights, income inequality, and political correctness. The liberals with the 1920s would likely clash with the liberals of today. That's just the ever-evolving nature of politics. For the time being, though, being a villain usually means being conservative to a certain extent. Conservatives are more likely to be the rich, greedy business types who would gladly burn down a rainforest full of puppies in order to raise profits. Conservatives are more likely to be rule-loving, fun-hating, curfew-enforcing religious zealots who wouldn't mind electing theocrats with every election. These types of individuals are far more likely to be villains in most stories these days. At the very least, they tolerate these villainous tendencies. It's easier to believe that those who side with the religious right and well-connected rich people will oppose a selfless, likable protagonist. From a purely narrative perspective, these kinds of villains just work better because they can be the authoritarian bullies that we root against. And when a hero opposes them, we want to cheer them on. Now, it's worth reiterating that it's guaranteed that political and cultural trends will change what it means to be conservative, liberal, and everything in between. But for now, if you were to bet on the political leanings of most antagonists, odds are they'll have a lot more in common with conservatives compared to liberals. Antagonists will continue to evolve, and as they evolve, their politics are likely to evolve as well. What they evolve into remains to be seen. Only time will tell. In the meantime, I look forward to seeing what kind of villains emerge in this unique political climate. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'm Jack Fisher, and thank you for joining me in my world. Please like, comment, and subscribe.